welcome to Know Your Rights. This is the show where you hear directly from lawyers who break down the law and explain the rights of citizens on common legal issues that confront Belizeans on a regular basis. Tonight, we will be discussing voting rights as reflected in the representation of the People's Act. As municipal elections draw near, it is important for you to know what your rights are and how the process works when registering to vote, voting, and what happens after the ballots have been casted. Joining us to give insight on this timely topic is Mr. Albert Edwards, Deputy Solicitor General in the Attorney General's Ministry. Good evening and welcome, Mr. Edwards.
Good evening, Khadija. Happy to be here.
Thank you for coming. It is indeed a timely topic.
Indeed.
We're 2 days away, right?
Right.
And I'm sure you're very busy.
And counting.
So you're here to tell us about voting rights, ROPA. What is ROPA?
ROPA is the Representation of the People Act, as you said, and it's the legislation that governs electoral procedure in Belize.
Okay.
It governs both national general elections as well as municipal elections.
Okay.
So it's basically the Bible for election procedure. And I should say that election procedure is one of the most highly regulated areas of practice in Belize, in public practice and governance.
Okay.
There's a lot of emphasis is placed on every detail, every step, because the exercise of the franchise to vote is not something to be taken for granted. It was hard-earned.
Yeah.
Yes, hard-earned.
It's the foundation of our democracy,
exactly,
right?
So exactly.
When did it come into being, though?
In 1978. So we're talking about, this year would make 40 years.
Okay.
We've had, it's predated independence.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's a very comprehensive document, and I'll be honest, I have not been able to read through the whole thing.
And I think most of us as lawyers haven't.
But if any citizen would get the opportunity to at least take a glance, it covers a lot of different areas of the entire voting procedure.
Yes,
as well as it touches on areas of, in terms of who are responsible to carry out or execute the items under the document.
Yes.
Which institution is this?
Well, the Electoral and Boundaries Commission, Elections and Boundaries Commission,
okay,
which is recognized under the Constitution, is the body that is given the responsibility for directing the electoral process in Belize.
Okay.
However, on a day-to-day basis, it is the Chief Elections Officer who has the delegated authority to operate the election process through the Election and Boundaries Department. So for the average person, it would be the Election and Boundaries Department headed by the Chief Elections Officer who administers the day-to-day process in relation to voting and has to face the limelight or the criticism.
Oh, okay. If anything, go
exactly.
So the Elections and Boundaries is where you go to start off your whole process in terms of registering?
Yes, you make an application to the Chief Elections Officer, and for most persons they would know that eventually they would have representatives of the Election and Boundaries Department, election officers who would visit and process individual voters.
Okay, let's get a little bit more into the voters, and we'll touch briefly on registration because for one, if you had to think about register for municipal elections coming in 2 days,
too late.
So we just want to touch on it, but really get into the procedure, which will affect most Belizeans coming up.
Sure.
So in terms of registering, when you go, what is the process and what do you need to be eligible to be registered as a voter?
Okay, essentially for municipal elections, it is expected that you would be a citizen. That's the basic qualification as a citizen of Belize, not just a resident, a Belizean citizen.
Okay.
And then you would also, or you could be a citizen of another country, but you would have to have a resident base in Belize.
Okay.
And then you would also have to be someone who is resident in the electoral division, in district where you are seeking to exercise your vote.
Living in your constituency.
Living in the constituency.
Okay.
Yes, yes, yes.
In terms, I just want to ask you, you said non-citizen residing in Belize. Do you need a certain number of years to be living here as well as working here? At least 1 year.
At least 1 year.
1 year.
Yes,
okay.
at least 1 year.
Okay.
Continuous residence.
Okay.
Yes.
And what about citizens who are not here? Citizens of the diaspora especially, who we're hearing quite a bit from lately,
yes.
wanting to be heard and wanting
yes.
to be a part of Belize's
yes.
process.
Yes.
What about them?
There is not specific provision for Belizeans in the diaspora. There's provision for proxy voting, but that proxy voting is for very specific categories.
Okay.
And the categories of citizens who are based outside of the country who would be eligible for voting would be those who are serving in certain public offices, such as in diplomatic missions, you know, but not the average Belizean who resides outside of the country. You know, and proxy voting is also extended to persons who are in the security services, such as the Police Defense Force, the Belize Police Department. Yes, so it's a restricted category to whom proxy voting is eligible.
Yeah, I realized it was restricted when I was away studying. And I thought I could proxy because it would have been the first time I would have been able to vote in a general election. And I was told, no, you actually, it's only for certain people.
Yes, if you had a position in the mission overseas, maybe you could have.
So in terms of the process, after registration is seen through, is that when you are issued the voter's ID?
Well, it's actually quite a detailed process because the election officers who work with the Elections and Boundaries Department have to verify for themselves that you are qualified. Not just qualified in terms of citizenship and residence in the country, but also qualified in terms of residence in the community. Because remember, we're talking about, in this case, municipal elections. So you have to have resided in your area for at least 2 months. So in other words, if you've moved from one area to another, you would not be eligible to transfer without a certain waiting period. So it's important because what you're doing is seeking representation within your local area. So it's expected that you have some connection with the locality. So once that information is verified, the officers would have met with you. You would be, once they're satisfied that you are who you say you are and that you've been resident for the required period of time, then registration card will be completed, photographs will be taken, and then further processing is done in the office of the Election and Boundaries Department. So it takes some time before you are actually declared a registered voter, because your name also has to appear on the register of electors, and then that is published, and then there's opportunity for objections to be made. Somebody, a neighbor may say, but this person is going to be living here for 1 week and is trying to register in this. You know, people do make objections. So once all that process has been completed and it's verified that you are properly eligible to vote, then you would be issued with your voter's ID card, which would have your photograph on it.
Okay, hence the cutoff period then.
Hence the cutoff period, yes.
It's interesting, the whole where you reside, because I walked the streets and I found houses where I won't say where, but at least 10 or 15 persons reside there, allegedly. So does the commission actually try and do these checks to ensure that the persons are in these areas?
They do, they do. And yes, exactly. And they're expected to be able to have documents that would show some connection with your residence, whether it be, you know, like a utility bill, social security ID documents such as that, which would give an indication of your status in the community.
Okay. Suppose an officer deems you unfit to be registered, and you do not feel that you are not qualified. You felt like you have all that it takes.
Yes.
How can you challenge that?
Okay, well, there's a document called a Notice of Disallowance, which is something that the registering officer, and that's an officer with the Elections and Boundaries Department, can issue if for any reason they doubt your eligibility to be registered.
Okay.
So they issue this Notice of Disallowance, but then you as a citizen have a right of appeal.
Okay.
Yes.
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 Yeah. So when we get back, we need to take a short commercial break, but when we get back, I want to get more into the voters and the process.
Sure.
So we will be right back to continue our discussion on voting rights and representation of the People's Act. Welcome back to Know Your Rights. I am Khadija Usher, and our guest tonight is Mr. Albert Edwards, and we are discussing voting rights, representation of the People Act, because as municipal elections are near, it is essential for voters to know and exercise their rights. So we were talking during the break,
yes.
and you actually alerted me to the fact that we're entering into a re-registration period very shortly. When is that, and how does it work?
Yes, it will begin in another 3-4 months, summer by July. And the whole idea is that registration is to be continuous. That's a principle that underlies an activity such as re-registration.
Okay.
It's also important to verify and update the register of electors.
Yeah.
So the re-registration is a standard procedure. Now, what is important is that voters or persons aspiring to become voters do this process on a timely basis.
Okay.
Do not wait until elections are called.
I'm coming.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And municipal elections are a statutory requirement every 3 years.
Okay.
So you know from this year that the next due elections are in 2021.
Because they would overburden the commission, wouldn't
And
it?
the department, the officers of the Elections and Boundaries
Yeah.
Department, indeed. And you see, you remember, if the process is overburdened, it means that all the verification procedures are also likely to be under strain.
Yes.
And persons, it's possible that persons may not be able to complete the process in time for them to exercise their franchise at the next municipal election.
Yes, yes.
So,
and we don't want anybody not to be able to exercise that
no,
right.
no.
Yes.
And in fact, one of the basic principles or guides in relation to exercising voting, whether it's on the day in question or in the process, is to do things early.
Yes.
Even on the day of elections, go early.
Well, I like that you brought us into the day of elections, because that's where I want us to go now. I'm the voter. I'm going to the ballot. What do I need to bring along with me? What do I need to have? What do I need to know? What should I expect walking into that room?
Yes. Well, first of all, you should walk in with confidence.
That's a nice one. I like that. I like that. I like that.
And then in addition to that, you should have your voter's ID card.
That. Okay.
Now, if you don't have your voter's ID card, it does not restrict you from voting. You still have a right to exercise your franchise. However, it's a little more complicated if you do not have your ID card.
Okay, okay.
You are liable to be questioned by the presiding officer, because verification has to be made as to your identity. But once the officer is satisfied that you are who you say you are, then you would be eligible to vote. However, in a situation like that, the presiding officer would have to notify the agents of the candidates of the circumstances.
Okay.
The candidates are entitled to have agents at the polling station to observe the process. So, in the interest of transparency and to reduce unnecessary questions or petitions, it's important that if a person is given the opportunity to vote without the standard voting ID card, that there is alternative means of verifying their identity. So I would advise anyone who knows that they are on the register, but for some reason can't find the card, you know, they walk with alternative photo identification, whether it's your passport, your driver's license, you know.
Social Security.
Social Security,
Okay. And so you arrive in the room, and it's interesting because I didn't know that part about if you don't have the voter's ID, the agents of the parties are notified, or so I didn't know that was a part of it. There are a lot of intricacies in the room. So what should the voter be concerned about after presenting either the voter ID or the ID card? What's the next stage?
Well, the next stage is that they would be presented with the ballot paper. So the ballot paper is issued. If you are diligent, as I expect every voter should be, you would want to ensure that your name is marked off on the list of voters. And the next thing that you'll be asked to do is to dip your index finger to the joint, to this point, in indelible ink. And the purpose of that is to ensure that there's no double voting. You know, you're entitled to vote once. So you present the ballot paper that you have been handed with to the presiding officer. The presiding officer is supposed to initial the ballot paper, and then you take it and exercise your vote. Now, it's important to understand what the ballot paper looks like, because this is the most critical point of the process. And it is secret. That's another thing. You are entitled to secrecy. It's a secret ballot. What is on record is the fact that you have voted, but not how you have voted. And even the paper is to be folded a certain way so that it exposes the initials of the presiding officer, but of course not how you have voted. Yes. I don't know if we have an illustration of a ballot paper.
I'm not sure if we have an illustration. We can check for it as soon as we get back. But in terms of casting the vote now, you said it is a private process. Let's say, for instance, the voter is in the room casting and he feels like something is not right in the process. Something's not going right. Maybe somebody said something to him who is officiating, or he sees something funny that he does not think should be happening in there. What stages can the voter take at that point there?
Well, at that point, it would be difficult to actually, well, the voter can indicate to the presiding officer that the purpose of having a presiding officer is to be the neutral umpire and director of the process. So if you have any doubt as to, for instance, if you're presented with a ballot paper and suspect that something is wrong with it, either it's incomplete or it's damaged or so on, then you can indicate to the presiding officer that you have that there's a problem with this ballot paper. Or if you suspect that the actual the ballot box is in some way suspect or not secure, because security is very important at every stage of the process.
Yes.
So if you suspect that the ballot box itself is not secure, that its integrity is affected, then you immediately report that to the presiding officer.
Yeah, yeah.
There are a number of what are known as election offenses that can be committed, because the integrity of the election process is critical.
Yes.
Maintaining the integrity of the process is critical. So if there is any inducement, if there's any intimidation,
Yeah.
if there is any sense that the secrecy of your vote has been compromised,
Yeah.
whether by election officers or other persons, agents or other persons, exactly,
yes.
then these are bases for criminal proceedings.
Yeah.
And some of the penalties are quite serious.
Yes. We need to take one more short break, and then afterwards we will continue our discussion on voting rights. Welcome back to Know Your Rights. I am Khadija Usher, and our guest tonight is Mr. Albert Edwards, and we are discussing voting rights, representation of the People Act, because as municipal elections near, it is essential for voters to know and exercise their rights. So we were speaking about the voters and the process. In cases where persons are not physically able to cast the vote themselves, maybe they suffer from some sort of disability, how does that work? Are they just excluded? They just cannot exercise their rights?
The law is very strict in terms of having the voter physically present. That's the basic requirement, that you must be physically present and that you must exercise your franchise in person at the division that you are entitled to vote. Okay. And it's actually an offense if you seek to fraudulently exercise franchise at an electoral division that you're not entitled to do so. However, if you are able to be physically present but are suffering from a disability, let's say you are visually impaired, you're blind, you have a physical disability that makes it impossible or unreasonable for you to actually be able to dip a finger. For instance, you may for some reason not be able to use your hands, then you can carry an assistant along.
Okay.
You are entitled to have somebody assist you, and that person is entitled to make the mark on your behalf.
Okay.
But you still have to be present. But if for any reason you're unable to do the physical act of voting, you can carry an assistant with you.
So this is the only circumstance whereby somebody would be with you casting that vote in that area.
Exactly.
Aside from that, under no circumstance is anybody to be privy to how you vote, as you said.
Exactly. Unless, of course, you are the proxy. Unless you're somebody who is entitled to be a proxy for another person. And I should also say that even the proxy voter must also be a qualified elector. You can't have somebody who themselves would not be eligible to vote being a proxy for you. But those are the only circumstances. Yes.
And we're speaking about anybody else being able to see how you vote. Now, there is an area that I think we should touch because it's become a very common catchphrase, as in take the money and vote how you want, in a way. And because of that, I know the Commission has been very much vigilant for people using tech devices to capture images of how they vote and to be shown as evidence in case of a bribe was made. How is bribery handled under the Act?
Well, bribery, I would speak of bribery in the broader sense of corruption and anti-corruption provisions in relation to the behavior of public officers. The Prevention of Corruption Act would govern any act of bribery, any act of improper impropriety on the part of a public officer. That will be governed by the Prevention of Corruption Act.
Okay.
There are a range of offenses in relation to voting where you may be able to have prohibition in relation to undue influence and that kind of activity. However, I would still say the Prevention of Corruption Act, if we're talking about bribery per se, would be the legislation that you would go to fundamentally. Yes.
Because it's become a bit of a culture. Persons are saying, well, they won't leave their house until they get their amount and then they go there. So has the
well, the
procedure...
question is, are we talking about election officers? Because the bribery in terms of the public and governance is usually in relation to public officials. So if we're talking about public officials, then we're speaking of Prevention of Corruption Act.
Okay.
Yes.
But just generally in the procedure, is there anything new for voters to look out for in terms of not being allowed to take in devices or to be expected to be watched under suspicion of in these cases?
Definitely restrictions on cellular phones.
Okay.
Yes, cellular phones.
Okay.
I'm not sure of the exact process, but you may be asked to temporarily, put away your phone.
Okay.
And definitely no photographing. The whole process is to be kept secret.
Yeah, as
yes.
you said.
Even your own vote.
Your own vote
is to be kept secret.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Mr. Edwards, what are the final words you want to emphasize to the public, especially going into these municipal elections?
I would say the watchword is vigilance.
Okay.
Vigilance. A simple thing like being very careful how you vote. People sometimes make careless errors in the, in the polling booth.
And I'm nervous.
Yes, and invalidate their votes.
Yeah.
So you have very specific provisions for spoiled ballots, and sometimes it's so unfortunate that people may make errors in voting, not just spoiling the ballot, but they may vote for in a way that they didn't intend to, just because they have not studied the ballot paper carefully. So I would encourage persons to be very vigilant, both in terms of ensuring the security of the process and that there's nothing untoward in the actual polling station, polling booth, ballot box, but that they also are careful to take their time. Nobody's rushing you. Take your time, exercise your franchise carefully, and then go home.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. But unfortunately, we have come to the end of our show for tonight. Thank you, Mr. Edwards, for joining us and providing important information on tonight's topics. Know Your Rights will be back on Monday, March 19th, when we will be joined by another guest attorney who will also break down your rights on another exciting topic. Tonight's episode of Know Your Rights repeats at 1 p.m. on Sunday on Channel 7, and it will also be available for your viewing on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for watching, and good night.